Welcome back, everyone, to another week and another edition of Interventions and Detentions with Brad. I'm your host. If you're new here, this is the podcast where we talk about the real stuff in education, not just the buzzwords, though we do talk about those sometimes too. Not just the polished conference presentations, but the things that actually happen in schools every single day. The things teachers talk about in the hallway, the things administrators wrestle with every day, the things parents sometimes see and sometimes don't see. And today we're diving into a topic that honestly sits at the center of almost everything that happens inside a school building each and every day. And that topic is classroom management. Why some classrooms run smoothly and others just don't. Let me start with a question. Why is it that two classrooms in the same school with the same students can feel completely different? One room runs smoothly, students know the expectations, learning happens, and right down the hallway, another classroom feels like chaos. So what's the difference? Classroom management. And that's today's focus. What actually works, what doesn't, and why the system matters more than most people realize. Now, classroom management is one of those phrases that gets thrown around constantly in education. The teacher prep programs talk about it. Administrators like me evaluate it. Parents sometimes question it. Teachers stress about it. But if you ask 10 different educators to define it, you'll probably get 10 different answers. Some people think classroom management means discipline, and that is a part of it. Some people think it means control. Some people think it means structure. And some people think it's really just about relationships. But here's the reality. You can have the most engaging lesson in the world. You can know your content better than anyone. And you can have the best technology, the best activities, the best ideas. But if you cannot manage the classroom environment that you're working in, none of that stuff matters. Because learning doesn't happen in chaos. And this is something that every teacher realizes at some point in their career, usually pretty early, sometimes painfully early. And there's actual research on this. The National Council on Teacher Quality has consistently found that classroom management is the number one challenge for new teachers. It's not the lesson planning. It's not grading. It's not even curriculum. It's classroom management. And when you talk to teachers who are leaving the profession early, and that's happening way too often, this is the topic that comes up again and again and again. Because the stress of constantly trying to regain control of a classroom can be exhausting. Here's another stat that really jumps out. A study from Education Week found that teachers lose an average of 2 to 3 weeks of instructional time per year dealing with disruptions and behavior issues. Now think about that. 2 to 3 weeks. That's not a small number, folks. That is an entire unit in some classes. That's material that could have been covered, skills that could have been developed, learning opportunities that just disappeared. And a lot of that lost time comes down to one thing: systems, or the lack of them. Because when you walk down the hallway in almost any school, something interesting happens. Every classroom looks a little different. One classroom has a clip chart. Another classroom has table points. Another classroom is running some type of PBIS reward system, positive behavior intervention system. Another classroom is focusing heavily on restorative practices. Maybe another classroom might not appear to have any visible system at all, but somehow it's running pretty smoothly. And that raises some really interesting questions. Are some classroom management systems better than others? Should schools have consistent expectations across every classroom, or should teachers have the freedom to run their rooms however they want to? What works for them? And then there's another piece of this conversation that sometimes just gets ignored altogether, and that's parents. Because classroom management doesn't stop when the bell rings. It doesn't stop when the buses pull away. If expectations exist in the classroom but disappear at home, teachers are fighting an uphill battle, and I feel like that's a lot of where we're at today, unfortunately. And I'm not pointing the finger, and I'm not saying it's anybody's fault. I just think it's the time of our lives. It's where we're at, the era that we're in. So today we're going to unpack a few things: what classroom management actually is and what it isn't, some systems that teachers commonly use, some things that research says works well, some things that maybe don't work well or maybe as well as we think, and maybe most importantly, what the best classroom managers consistently do that others sometimes just struggle with. Because when you watch a really effective teacher manage their classroom, something really interesting happens. It really looks effortless for the most part. It looks calm, it's predictable, it looks smooth, but behind that calm classroom is usually a lot of intentional structure. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with a basic question. What is classroom management? Because again, a lot of people immediately think it means discipline. Things like sending students out of the classroom to the office, writing referrals, taking away privileges. But that's not actually classroom management. That's reacting to a behavior. Good classroom management happens before the behavior ever occurs. I'm going to repeat that. Good classroom management happens before the behavior or misbehavior even occurs. And this is something you really start to notice when you observe a lot of classrooms over time. Some classrooms feel calm the moment you walk into them. The students are doing what they're supposed to do. They know what to do. They come in, they grab their materials, they sit down, they get started. The teacher really doesn't have to say much or give much direction. The room just flows and functions. And then there are the other classroom where things feel a little more chaotic, a little more disrupted. Students come in, some sit down, some wander around. Maybe some ask some questions about what they're supposed to be doing. Some start talking to their friends. The teacher's constantly trying to get everyone on the same page. Now, the difference between those two classrooms usually isn't the students. It's the systems and the routines that have been built over time. There's actually some really interesting research on this. A study published in the Journal of Educational Psychology found that classrooms with clearly taught routines and expectations reduced disruptive behavior by nearly 30%. 30%. That's huge. And the key word there is taught, not announced, not just posted on a poster on the wall, but they were taught. Because students don't automatically know how a classroom's supposed to run. They have to learn it. And the best teachers treat routines almost like curriculum. They practice them, they model them, they reinforce them, they revisit them when necessary. And over time, those routines become habits. And when routines become habits, the classroom runs smoother. Another interesting piece of research comes from John Hattie's visible learning work. When researchers looked at factors that influence student learning, classroom environment and teacher-student relationships had some of the strongest effects on academic success, which means classroom management isn't just about behavior. It's about learning. If students feel safe, if expectations are clear, if routines are predictable, students are more likely to engage. And engagement is where learning actually happens. Now, once teachers understand the importance of routines and expectations, the next question usually becomes this: what kind of system should I actually use? Because there's so many out there. If you walk through almost any school in America, you're going to see a wide range of those classroom management approaches and systems. Some teachers love the reward system. Some love behavior charts. Some rely almost entirely on relationships. When I was teaching in a fifth grade classroom, I used all of those. It just depended for me year to year, group to group, because every student kind of functions differently within each system. And some teachers operate with systems that are almost invisible to outsiders, but still they work incredibly well. So let's start with one of the most common approaches in schools today. And that's positive reinforcement systems. You see these everywhere. Like I said, I've used them before too. Table points, class points, tickets, tokens, PBIS rewards. For me, it was Taggart tokens, little dollar bills with my face on them that looked like money that kids could earn and spend in the classroom. There's other things like something simple as a jar where students earn marbles for good behavior. Did that one too. Sometimes it's something more structured where students collect points toward a class reward, but the idea behind these systems comes from Just plain old behavioral psychology. Positive behavior that gets reinforced tends to repeat itself. And research does support that idea. Some studies have shown that positive reinforcement systems can reduce disruptive behavior in the classroom by 20 to 50% when they're implemented consistently. And for younger students, especially, that motivation can be super powerful. Kids enjoy working towards something. They like recognition, they like earning privileges, but there's also an important balance that has to happen. Because if every expectation becomes tied to a reward, students can start asking a question teachers don't really want to hear. What do I get if I do it? And that's where teachers sometimes have to recalibrate because some of the behaviors are simply expectations of being part of a classroom community. Things like listening when someone else is speaking, respecting your fellow students, completing your schoolwork. Those things eventually have to become habits, not transactions. So reward systems can work, but they tend to work best when they're used intentionally and not overused. Another system that many teachers still use is what we might call the traditional behavior chart system. If you went to school in the 80s, 90s, maybe even early 2000s, you probably remember these. Things like clip charts, clip up or clip down, but depending on your behavior. Or that green card that means you're doing well, and yellow means a warning, red means a consequence. These systems are straightforward. Students understand them immediately. Parents understand them, which helps as well. And there's something to be said for clarity and predictability. But over time, these systems have also received some criticism. Some educators argue that public behavior charts can embarrass students. Others believe they focus too much on punishment rather than teaching students how to improve behavior. Now, like most things in education, the reality is rarely black and white. Okay? A system itself is rarely the problem. It's usually how the system is used. A teacher who uses a behavior chart in a supportive way may have great results. Another teacher who uses the same chart in a harsh or inconsistent way really might see the opposite outcome. Which brings us to another classroom management philosophy that has gained a lot of attention over the past decade, and that's relationship-based management. This approach focuses heavily on the idea that students behave better for teachers that they trust and respect, which honestly, most teachers already know. Think about your own experiences growing up. Most of us probably behaved differently depending on the teacher that we had. There were teachers we respected deeply. There were teachers that we didn't want to disappoint, teachers whose classrooms just felt different. And research backs that up. Again, education researcher John Hattie found that strong teacher-student relationships have a significant positive effect on both behavior and learning outcomes. Students who feel connected to their teacher are more likely to engage in class and less likely to act out. But relationships alone are not a management system. Even teachers who have incredible relationships with their students still need boundaries. They still need structure. And the most effective classrooms usually combine relationships with those clear expectations. Now, there's another piece to classroom management that sometimes gets left out of the conversation completely, and that's the parent piece. Because when we talk about classroom management, we often talk about teachers alone. We talk about teacher training, we talk about the teacher systems, we talk about discipline, but the reality really is teachers are not the only adults influencing a child's behavior. Students are constantly receiving messages about expectations from multiple places and multiple people. From school and the adults at school, from home and the adults at home, from their peers. Nowadays, social media, from the broader culture around them. And when those messages start to line up and stack up, classroom management becomes much easier. But when those messages conflict, that's when things get a little complicated. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine a student who is told to he's told at school to show respect because respect matters, that listening when someone else is speaking matters, that following directions matters. But then that same student hears at home something like this: your teacher's just picking on you, or that rule doesn't make any sense, Or maybe even something like, you don't have to listen to them if they're being unfair. Now, from the parent's perspective, that may just be trying to, be them trying to defend their child. I think that's pretty, that instinct is natural. Parents want to protect their kids, but the unintended message that the child receives is this: that teacher's authority is now optional. And once students start believing that, classroom management becomes exponentially harder. Now, to be fair, the opposite can also happen. When parents reinforce expectations at home, it changes everything. Research from the National Education Association has shown that students whose parents actively support school expectations tend to show stronger engagement and better behavior in the classroom. And most teachers can tell you stories about this. You can often tell pretty quickly which students hear consistent expectations at home. Because when something goes wrong in class and you communicate with the parent, the response might be something like, from the parent, "Thank you for letting me know. We'll talk about this at home." That simple moment is powerful because the student realizes something important. The adults in their life are on the same team. They're on the same page. Now, that doesn't mean parents and teachers always have to agree on everything, but when they respect each other's roles, the students benefit. And here's something that I think is important to say. Most parents genuinely want their child to succeed at school. No question. They want their children to learn. They want their children to grow into responsible adults. But sometimes there's that disconnect between what parents think classrooms look like and what they actually look like. Many parents remember school from 20 to 30 years ago. And as we've talked about in the recent past year, classrooms were different. The expectations were much different, and technology didn't exist in that scenario like it does today. And student behavior has changed in many ways too. Teachers today are navigating challenges that didn't exist a generation ago. Constant digital distraction, social media conflicts that spill over into the classroom, students who sometimes struggle with attention and self-regulation more than we saw in the past. And when you combine those challenges with inconsistent expectations between home and school, classroom management becomes much harder. So one of the most powerful things that can happen is when teachers and parents see each other as partners rather than opponents. Because when the partnership exists, students receive that clear message that respect matters, responsibility matters, and expectations matter everywhere, not just inside the classroom. Now let's talk honestly about some things that tend not to work very well when it comes to classroom management. And if you've been in education for a while, some of these are probably going to sound very familiar. The first one is empty threats. Every teacher and educator has heard it. If you do that again, and then nothing actually happens. Students are incredibly good at detecting patterns. They're like little scientists constantly testing that environment. They're watching, they're observing, they're figuring out where those boundaries actually are. So if a teacher repeatedly says there will be a consequence, but the consequence never really materializes or happens, students eventually learn something very important. That boundary that's trying to be set isn't even real. And once students believe that, behavior will escalate. Another thing that often doesn't work well is inconsistency. One day a teacher ignores a behavior. The next day that same behavior gets a strong reaction. From the student perspective, the rules feel unpredictable. Students want to know where that line is, and if the line keeps moving, they'll keep trying to find it. Consistency doesn't mean being harsh. It just means expectations need to stay steady. Students know what will happen if they cross the line, and because they know what will happen, they often choose not to cross it. Another trap teachers sometimes fall into is trying too hard to be the, quote, cool teacher, unquote. And this usually comes from a good place. I mean, teachers want students to like them. They want their classroom to feel positive, and they want strong relationships, and all of those things are important, don't get me wrong. But when teachers start sacrificing expectations in order to be liked, problems are going to follow because students don't actually respect teachers who remove those boundaries. Students respect teachers who are fair, they respect teachers who are predictable, and they respect teachers who follow through. In fact, some of the teachers students respect the most are the ones who hold them to those high expectations, but they do it with consistency and care. And then there's one more thing that can quietly undermine classroom management altogether, and that's when teachers take student behavior personally, which is so easy to do. Students are going to say things. They're going to test those limits and cross those lines. They're going to push those boundaries. And that's just part of being a kid and being young and part of learning, actually. And when teachers react emotionally instead of strategically, situations can escalate quickly. The most effective classroom managers stay calm. They address behavior without turning it into a personal battle. Because the goal isn't to win an argument, even though we adults feel like we need to sometimes. I've been there myself. The goal is just to keep the classroom environment focused on learning. The whole reason why we're there, right? And when teachers stay calm and consistent, students eventually realize something. The expectations aren't about the teacher's mood. They're about the classroom community. And once that message becomes clear, classroom management becomes so much easier. Now, before we wrap up the conversation about classroom management, I want to spend a little time talking about something that I've noticed over the years working in schools. Because when you observe enough classrooms, something becomes really clear. There are certain teachers whose classrooms just run more smoothly, like we've talked about. You walk into that room, the environment feels calm, students know what they're doing, transitions happen quickly, instruction flows, and when behavior issues do pop up, they get handled quickly and without turning it into a big disruption. And what's interesting is that those teachers don't always use the same system. Some of them use reward systems, some of them don't. Some of them use behavior charts, some of them don't. Some of them just rely heavily on that relationship system, and others rely heavily on structure. But even though their systems may look different, the most effective classroom managers tend to have a few things in common. The first thing is that clarity of expectations. So if you're taking note, number one, clarity of expectations. Students in the classrooms know exactly what is expected of them. That has to be clear and it has to be taught. It's not just, academically what's expected of them, but behaviorally. They know what entering the room should look like. They know what working quietly should look like and what it should sound like. They know how to ask questions. They know how to transition, and how transitions work. And that clarity of those expectations removes a lot of guesswork, because when students don't understand expectations, they tend to test the boundaries more often than not. The second thing that great classroom managers do is they teach routines intentionally. And this is something that sometimes gets overlooked. We kind of take things for granted. The best teachers don't just tell students what the routine is. They practice it, they model it, they walk through it, they correct it, and then they revisit it when necessary. Because routines are really just habits, and habits take time to build. Think about the first few weeks of school. The teachers who invest time teaching procedures early often save themselves hours of frustration later in the year, because once routines become automatic, the classroom begins to run itself. We do this at my school, and I've done it for years at other buildings, where the very first day of school, sometimes the very first 2 days, is we teach our kids the procedures of the building. We go from station to station. It might be bus, it might be cafeteria, it might be playground, hallway, restrooms, just in general, what the rules are, what the expectations are, how to show respect in those areas. We model it, we talk about it, we teach it, we say what it doesn't look like, and we revisit it when it's necessary, whether that's 2 weeks after school starts, mid-year, at the last day of school. We practice it. We hold them accountable to those expectations. Another thing that effective classroom managers do is they remain calm when addressing a student's behavior. And honestly, this might be one of the hardest skills as a teacher and in teaching. When a student challenges you, When a student disrupts your class, when a student says something disrespectful to you or to somebody else in the classroom, it's very easy to react emotionally. We escalate. I think I had an episode on this about not escalating. The best classroom managers don't escalate situations unnecessarily. And it's hard. It's hard to keep ourselves regulated. These people address behavior calmly. They redirect. They follow through on consequences when needed, but they don't just turn behavior correction into a power struggle either, because power struggles almost never end well in classrooms. Students sometimes push back harder, the situation becomes more emotional, and suddenly the focus shifts away from learning altogether. The most effective teachers understand that their goal is not to win an argument. We don't need to win. We're the grown-ups. We're going to win every time anyway, right? The goal is to just keep the classroom environment focused on the learning. Don't worry about winning an argument or not. You're arguing with a kid. You're going to win anyway. So just do it calmly, respectfully, and do it in a way that doesn't belittle the child. Another strong classroom manager, another strategy that they do well, they build relationships with students without sacrificing those expectations. That balance is really, really important. Students should feel respected in the classroom. They should feel valued. They should feel safe. But they should also understand that expectations still exist, right? The best teachers find ways to show students that they care about them while still holding them accountable. And interestingly enough, students often respect those teachers the most, because students can sense authenticity when you're being real. They know when a teacher's trying too hard to be liked or to be that cool teacher. And they know when a teacher genuinely cares about their growth and their well-being. And then there's one more thing that I think really separates strong classroom managers from the rest. You ready? They're consistent. Their expectations don't change depending on the day or their mood. Students know what to expect from them every single day, and that's predictability. And that predictability builds trust. When students know the environment is fair and consistent, they feel safe inside of that environment. Now, does that mean strong classroom managers never deal with behavior problems? Of course not. Even the best ones do. That's just natural because that's just kids. Every classroom has its challenges. Every teacher has their tough days, and every student has moments where they struggle. But the difference is that strong classroom managers have systems that allow them to respond effectively without the classroom spiraling into chaos. And over time, those systems actually make a huge difference, not just for behavior, but for learning. When a classroom runs smoothly, teachers can spend less time managing disruptions. Remember, we said 2 to 3 weeks of lost instructional time at the beginning of this episode, just managing classroom behavior sometimes. It's a lot of wasted time. And more time that they have doing the things that they actually become teachers to do is really important for the teachers. They just want to teach, right? So as we wrap up today's episode and this topic, here's a question that might be worth thinking about. When we talk about classroom management, are we focusing on controlling behavior, or are we focusing on creating environments where students can just succeed? Because those are not always the same thing. The best classrooms are not necessarily the quietest. I've seen it. If a outsider would look into a well-managed classroom sometime, it might look noisy and a little bit of chaos involved too. They're not always the quietest classrooms, but they are the ones where expectations are clear, where relationships are strong, and students understand that the classroom is a place where everyone has a role in making learning possible. And when that happens, something really interesting occurs. The classroom stops feeling like a place where behavior has to constantly be managed, and it starts feeling more like a community where learning naturally happens. And folks, that is the goal right there. So with that, I want to thank you for listening again this week to Interventions and Detentions with your host, Brad. If you're an educator listening to this episode, I'd love to hear your thoughts, what resonated with you, what struggles you see around classroom management, What classroom management systems work well in your classrooms or your building? What things have you tried that didn't work so well? Share it out here when we post this episode out to our different social media outlets. Leave some comments. Because the reality is, we're all learning from each other as we go, folks. That's really what it is. And sometimes the best ideas come from simply sharing what we've experienced along the way. So don't be afraid to share. Let's get the discussion going. This has been Brad with Interventions and Detentions. It's where the real learning begins. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.